The stage was set for what was meant to be a defining media moment, a carefully orchestrated ambush designed to put Donald Trump on the defensive and strip away any semblance of control he had over his own narrative. It was prime time, a major network with millions of viewers watching live, and the host, a well-known liberal journalist infamous for her gotcha tactics against conservative guests, was ready. Her team had spent weeks refining their approach, crafting loaded questions designed to poke at Trump's personal life, particularly his marriage, in the hopes of making him stumble. They had combed through every interview, every comment, every tabloid rumor, looking for the precise angles to exploit. But what they didn't realize, what they never seemed to learn, was that Donald Trump had faced far worse adversaries than a television host armed with a stack of pre-planned jabs. He was no stranger to confrontational interviews, no rookie when it came to navigating media traps, and certainly not the kind of man to walk into an ambush without countermeasures of his own. He understood the media's playbook better than they did, and if there was one thing he thrived on, it was the opportunity to turn an attack into an advantage. As the cameras rolled, the host put on her signature smile, the kind of polished, insincere expression that television elites had perfected over the years. It was a smile meant to disguise condescension as curiosity, to feign professionalism while signaling to the audience that the guest in front of her was someone to be exposed, not respected. She began with a question that seemed harmless, almost complimentary, but carried an underlying implication. Mr. Trump, you've built an empire, become president, influenced millions. Would you say you're just lucky? The words were delivered with precision, setting the stage for the narrative she wanted to shape. If Trump agreed, he would diminish his own accomplishments, attributing them to chance rather than effort. If he disagreed, she would frame him as arrogant, dismissive of the notion that external factors played any role in his success. Either way, she believed, she had him right where she wanted. But Trump was already ahead of her. He leaned forward slightly, his expression one of amused confidence, as if he had seen this exact setup 100 times before. "You know," he began, his voice steady, controlled. "It's interesting that you ask that. The liberals love that word, lucky. They use it to diminish success, to suggest that hard work and sacrifice don't matter. But let me tell you something about luck. It doesn't build skyscrapers, it doesn't create thousands of jobs, and it certainly doesn't make America great." The shift in the room was almost imperceptible, but it was there. The host had expected defensiveness, maybe even an overcorrection, but instead she was met with a direct counterargument, one that didn't just dismiss her implication, but exposed the ideology behind it. She quickly adjusted, tightening her smile just a fraction, sensing that her first strike had not landed as intended. "So, you're saying everything you've achieved is purely through hard work?" she pressed, hoping to steer him toward a position that could be twisted into self-aggrandizement. Trump, however, was ready. "I'm saying that success comes to those who earn it," he replied, his voice gaining a touch of intensity. "Yes, I've been blessed, but I've also worked harder than most people can imagine. I've had nights where I didn't sleep, deals that seemed impossible, challenges that would have broken many others. But here's what really matters. I've never done it alone." That last sentence was what the host had been waiting for. She saw her opening, the crack in the armor she had hoped to find. "Not alone," she echoed, her voice taking on a tone of feigned curiosity. "Let's talk about that. Let's talk about the people behind Donald Trump." Her delivery was smooth, calculated. She was steering the conversation exactly where she wanted it to go, toward his personal life, toward Melania. The idea was to paint the picture of a man who took credit for everything, while the woman beside him was little more than an accessory to his success. It was a classic media tactic, subtly undermining strong conservative women by framing them as passive figures, irrelevant without the men they stood beside. But once again Trump saw it coming. He nodded, as if welcoming the conversation. "Of course," he said. "When you mention the people behind me, you're probably thinking of my business partners, my advisors, but let me tell you who really deserves the credit. My family, particularly Melania." There it was. He had taken control of the narrative before the host could steer it where she wanted. Instead of making it about him and what he had taken from those around him, he had made it about the people who had supported him, about values, about the strength of those who stood beside him. The host's expression shifted almost imperceptibly. A practiced journalist, she knew how to hide her reactions, but there was a flicker of something behind her eyes. Frustration, perhaps, or the realization that this was not going to be as easy as she had hoped. But she wasn't ready to back down just yet. "Ah, yes," she said, her voice carrying a hint of false amusement. "Melania. You know, many people wonder about her role in all of this. Some say she's rather quiet for such a powerful man's wife." The trap had been reset, this time with a different angle. The goal was clear: suggest that Melania was nothing more than a silent figure in the background, a passive observer rather than an active participant in Trump's world. It was meant to chip away at the image of a strong, intelligent woman and replace it with one of a mere trophy wife. Trump's eyes narrowed slightly. The studio air seemed to thicken with tension as he replied, "Quiet? No. Dignified? Yes. There's a big difference, though I understand why some in the media might not grasp that concept." A nervous titter rippled through the audience. The host shifted in her chair, clearly not expecting that level of pushback, but rather than backing off, she pressed on, her tone now taking on a more aggressive edge. "Well, what I mean is, we rarely hear from her, unlike other political wives, who are very visible. Don't you think the public deserves to know more about the woman behind Donald Trump?" The moment was set for what would become one of the most talked about interviews in recent memory. The host believed she had Trump cornered, that she had successfully pivoted the conversation toward an uncomfortable and controversial topic. But what she failed to realize was that she had walked straight into a trap of her own making. Because the next few minutes would not only dismantle her argument, but expose the very tactics that had defined her career. And by the time the interview was over, it wouldn't be Trump's reputation on the line, it would be hers. Trump leaned forward slightly in his chair, a flicker of amusement in his eyes as he absorbed the host's question. He had seen this strategy before, the slow, calculated lead-in meant to create the illusion of an even-handed discussion before the inevitable pivot to personal attacks. The host had carefully framed the question in a way that would make him look either out of touch or egotistical. If he credited his success to luck, he would undermine his own legacy. If he rejected the idea of luck entirely, he would be painted as arrogant, unwilling to acknowledge the role of circumstances in shaping his rise to power. But Trump had built an empire not just on business acumen, but on understanding people, reading intentions, and staying 3 steps ahead. And in that moment, he saw the game she was playing clearer than ever. "You know," he began, his voice steady but carrying the unmistakable edge of someone who was about to flip the entire conversation on its head, "it's interesting that you ask that. The liberals love that word, lucky. They use it to diminish success, to suggest that hard work and sacrifice don't matter. But let me tell you something about luck. It doesn't build skyscrapers, it doesn't create thousands of jobs, and it certainly doesn't make America great." He let the words hang in the air for just a second, enough for the weight of them to settle, before continuing. "Luck is what people say when they don't want to admit that someone worked harder than them, made better decisions than them, or took risks they weren't willing to take. And I don't say that to be disrespectful. I say that because it's the truth." The host's practiced smile tightened just slightly, a subtle tell that her opening move had not landed the way she expected. She had counted on Trump brushing the question aside or giving a short, generic answer. Instead, he had taken control of the narrative, reframing the entire premise of the question. But she wasn't ready to abandon her strategy just yet. "So, you're saying everything you've achieved is purely through hard work?" she pressed, carefully trying to steer him toward a statement that could be twisted into a soundbite of self-congratulation. Trump didn't miss a beat. "I'm saying that success comes to those who earn it," he responded, his voice gaining strength, the energy in the studio shifting as the audience began to sense that this was no ordinary interview. "Yes, I've been blessed, but I've also worked harder than most people can imagine. I've had nights where I didn't sleep, deals that seemed impossible, challenges that would have broken many others. I've had moments where everything was on the line, where one wrong move could have meant losing everything. And here's what really matters. I've never done it alone." That last sentence caught the host's attention. There it was, the angle she had been waiting for. Her team had spent weeks anticipating how to maneuver the conversation into an attack on Trump's personal life, particularly his marriage. and now he had handed her an opening. Or so she thought. "Not alone?" she echoed, her voice taking on that artificial curiosity that masked the sharp edge beneath. "Let's talk about that. Let's talk about the people behind Donald Trump." She paused, giving the audience just enough time to catch the subtext. Because, of course, when we think of those who support you, many people wonder about Melania. Some say she's rather quiet for such a powerful man's wife. Trump's expression didn't change, but there was a shift in his posture, just enough to indicate that he knew exactly what was happening. The trap was being set, the implication clear that Melania was nothing more than a background figure, a passive observer in the shadow of her husband's career. It was a tactic often used against conservative women, particularly those who chose dignity and restraint over media theatrics. But if the host thought she was about to corner Trump, she was about to learn just how wrong she was. "Quiet?" Trump repeated, tilting his head slightly. "No. Dignified? Yes. There's a big difference, though I understand why some in the media might not grasp that concept." A murmur rippled through the audience, a mixture of amusement and approval at the subtle jab. The host's lips pressed together just slightly before she quickly recovered, pushing forward. "Well, what I mean is, we rarely hear from her. Unlike other political wives who are very visible, don't you think the public deserves to know more about the woman behind Donald Trump?" Trump's response came without hesitation, delivered with the kind of unwavering certainty that made it clear he had been prepared for this moment from the beginning. "The public," he said, his voice carrying both pride and a protective steel, "knows exactly what they need to know about Melania. She's brilliant. She's accomplished. And most importantly, she chooses her moments carefully. Unlike some who feel the need to fill every silence with noise, she understands that true influence doesn't come from how often you speak, but from the weight of what you say when you do." The host's smile faltered for just a second, long enough for the cameras to catch it. The audience murmured again, this time more audibly, and even the production crew could sense that the power dynamic was shifting. She had walked into this exchange expecting Trump to either become defensive or to fall into the trap of diminishing his wife's public role. Instead, he had reframed the narrative yet again, positioning Melania not as a silent observer, but as a woman who understood the power of restraint, someone whose presence was not defined by the media's constant need for spectacle. But the host wasn't done yet. She still had more cards to play, and she was about to double down. "Let's talk about those accomplishments," she said, her tone shifting slightly, now carrying the edge of someone who knew they were running out of options but refused to back down. "Because some people say, well, they wonder if her main achievement isn't simply being Mrs. Donald Trump." The room seemed to go colder. Trump's expression didn't change, but the intensity in his eyes sharpened. Even the audience, many of whom had entered the studio expecting a standard political interview, could sense that something significant was about to happen. What had begun as a simple television segment was about to become something far bigger. And while the host thought she had finally backed Trump into a corner, she was about to realize that she had walked straight into one herself. Trump remained composed, his posture relaxed, but his expression sharp as he absorbed the host's words. He knew exactly where she was going with this. She was attempting to shift the conversation from his own success to Melania, not to celebrate her but to diminish her, to paint her as nothing more than a passive figure in his shadow. It was a classic media maneuver, one he had seen countless times before. The implication was clear. Unlike the politically outspoken and often media-adored wives of other leaders, Melania had chosen a different path, one of dignity, restraint, and quiet strength. And in the world of modern media, where volume often substitutes for substance, that choice was not just misunderstood, but deliberately misrepresented. Trump was not about to let that slide. "Yes, Melania," he said, leaning forward slightly, his voice carrying both warmth and steel. "You know, it's always interesting how the media talks about my wife. If she were constantly making headlines, constantly chasing the cameras, you'd call her attention-seeking. But because she chooses to carry herself with dignity and grace, suddenly she's too quiet? There's a big difference between being silent and being selective, between being passive and being poised. I understand why some people in the media might not grasp that concept." The response was met with murmurs from the audience, and for the first time, The host's polished smile wavered ever so slightly. This wasn't the reaction she had anticipated. She had expected either a defensive retort or an overcompensating tribute. But instead, Trump had done what he did best. He turned the narrative on its head, exposing the double standard that had been woven into the question itself. Still, the host wasn't ready to back down. She adjusted in her seat, feigning curiosity as she pressed on. "Well, what I mean is that we rarely hear from her. Unlike other political wives who are very visible, don't you think the public deserves to know more about the woman behind Donald Trump?" It was another attempt to frame Melania as a mere extension of her husband, rather than an accomplished individual in her own right. But Trump was already a step ahead. "The public," he said, his tone measured but firm, "knows exactly what they need to know about Melania. She's brilliant, she's accomplished, and most importantly, she chooses her moments carefully. Unlike some who feel the need to fill every silence with noise, she understands that true influence doesn't come from how often you speak, but from the weight of what you say when you do." The statement landed with force, and the shift in the room was unmistakable. There was an air of quiet agreement among many in the audience. Whether they supported Trump or not, they understood what he meant. There was an undeniable dignity in Melania's approach, a contrast to the media's obsession with constant self-promotion. The host, realizing she had yet to land a solid blow, quickly pivoted. "Let's talk about those accomplishments," she said, her voice carrying an almost imperceptible edge. "Because some people say, well, they wonder if her main achievement isn't simply being Mrs. Donald Trump." There it was. The trap had been set. She wasn't just questioning Melania's public role. She was insinuating that her worth was entirely dependent on her marriage, that she had no identity beyond being a political spouse. It was a transparent attempt to diminish her achievements, to reduce her to a status symbol rather than an individual of substance. Trump's expression hardened just slightly, but his voice remained steady, controlled. "Let me be very clear about something," he said, his tone carrying the unmistakable weight of conviction. "Since you want to talk about achievements, let's talk facts. Melania speaks 5 languages fluently. She built her own successful career before ever meeting me. She's represented our country with more grace and dignity than any first lady in recent memory. But you wouldn't know about that, would you? Because the mainstream media is too busy pushing their own narrative." The audience responded with murmurs of agreement, and the host's practiced composure faltered for just a second. She had expected Trump to fall into a defensive posture, to scramble to justify Melania's contributions, but instead he had turned the question back on her, highlighting not just Melania's achievements, but the media's refusal to acknowledge them. The message was clear. This wasn't about Melania's qualifications, it was about the media's unwillingness to recognize them. Sensing that she was losing control of the conversation, the host quickly attempted to shift gears. "Of course, Mr. Trump," she said, her voice laced with forced politeness. "But don't you think that being married to you has opened certain doors for her?" It was another thinly veiled attempt to discredit Melania's accomplishments, to frame them as a byproduct of Trump's influence rather than her own merit. Trump let out a short chuckle, but there was no humor in it. "You know what's interesting about that question?" he asked, tilting his head slightly. "It shows exactly what's wrong with how some people think. Success isn't about doors being opened, it's about what you do once you're in the room. And Melania? She doesn't just walk through doors, she transforms every room she enters." The response landed like a thunderclap. The audience erupted into applause, and the host's face paled just slightly as she realized her carefully constructed attack was crumbling in real time. Trump had not only defended Melania, he had elevated her, reframing the conversation in a way that made the host's line of questioning seem petty, even condescending. What was meant to be an attack on Melania's independence had instead become a celebration of her strength. But the host wasn't done yet. She was running out of angles, but she had one last card to play, and she was about to make the biggest mistake of her career. "Surely," she said, her voice now carrying a note of forced nonchalance, "you must admit that your position, your wealth, your influence, it all affects how people see her." Trump's response was immediate, and this time there was a sharpness to it that silenced the entire room. "You mean how people like you see her?" he asked, his gaze locked onto the host. "Because let me tell you something about influence and wealth. They don't create character, they reveal it. And what Melania has revealed through every challenge, every attack, every unfair criticism is exactly why I'm proud to have her by my side. The host opened her mouth, but no words came out. She had walked straight into her own trap, and for the first time that night it was clear that she knew it. The conversation had shifted beyond her control, and the audience, the cameras, and the millions watching at home had seen it happen in real time. And Trump? He was just getting started. The host had spent the last several minutes carefully navigating the conversation, searching for an opening, a weakness, any moment where she could land a decisive blow. But so far, Trump had been unshakable, flipping every attempt to undermine him or Melania into an opportunity to expose the media's bias. The audience was engaged, watching not just an interview but a battle of narratives. And for the first time, the host realized that she was losing. Her tactics, so effective against other conservative guests who fumbled under pressure, had not only failed but had backfired, making Trump appear even stronger. She needed to change that, and so she reached for what she thought would be her most effective weapon, the idea that Melania Trump, despite everything, was nothing more than a byproduct of her husband's influence, that her achievements, whatever they may be, were insignificant when measured against the identity she had taken on as Mrs. Donald Trump. Leaning in slightly, the host adopted a more aggressive tone, abandoning the faux warmth she had employed earlier. "Let's talk about those accomplishments," she said, carefully modulating her voice to sound inquisitive rather than outright hostile. "Because some people say, well, they wonder if her main achievement isn't simply being Mrs. Donald Trump." The words hung in the air for a moment, deliberately chosen to sound like an innocent question while carrying the full weight of condescension. She knew exactly what she was implying, that Melania, for all the attention she received, had done nothing of real significance, that her worth was derived entirely from her marriage, that without Trump, she was just another anonymous figure. And she expected Trump to react, to jump into a defensive posture, to protest in a way that would make it seem as though even he had to stretch to justify his wife's accomplishments. But that reaction never came. Instead, Trump's expression changed, not with anger, not with frustration, but with something far more powerful, absolute certainty. He sat back slightly, nodding to himself, as if he had anticipated this exact moment and was simply waiting for it. When he finally spoke, his voice was steady, but there was a new weight to it, a firmness that made it clear he was about to say something that would not just rebut the host's question, but dismantle the entire premise behind it. "Let me be very clear about something," he said, pausing just long enough for the room to settle. "Since you want to talk about achievements, let's talk facts. Melania speaks 5 languages fluently. She built her own successful career before ever meeting me. She's represented our country with more grace and dignity than any first lady in recent memory. But you wouldn't know about that, would you? Because the mainstream media is too busy pushing their own narrative." The response hit like a freight train. There was a distinct shift in the room, a murmur running through the audience as they processed what had just happened. Trump hadn't just answered the question, he had reframed it, exposing it for what it was, an attempt to erase Melania's real accomplishments in favor of a dismissive, media-crafted caricature. And as he sat there, watching the host struggle to recover, it became clear that she had made a grave mistake. For the first time, she hesitated. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. She had expected him to deflect, to stumble, to make some vague statement about how Melania was important to him. Instead, he had gone on the offensive, citing tangible achievements, speaking with conviction, and, worst of all for her, resonating with the audience. But she couldn't afford to show weakness. She had to keep pushing. "Of course, Mr. Trump," she said, trying to regain her footing, "but don't you think that being married to you has opened certain doors for her?" It was a desperate pivot, an attempt to downplay the weight of what he had just said by suggesting that Melania's success was merely a byproduct of Trump's status. If she could make the audience believe that Melania hadn't actually earned her position, then Trump's argument would collapse. Trump let out a short chuckle, but it wasn't a laugh of amusement. It was a laugh of recognition, the kind someone gives when they see an opponent making a predictable mistake. "You know what's interesting about that question?" he asked, tilting his head slightly. "It shows exactly what's wrong with how some people think. Success isn't about doors being opened. It's about what you do once you're in the room. And Melania? She doesn't just walk through doors, she transforms every room she enters. The words struck hard. The audience broke into spontaneous applause, and the host's face flushed slightly as she realized she was losing control of the conversation. Trump had turned her question, meant to reduce Melania to a secondary figure, into a powerful defense of her influence and capability. But she wasn't done yet. She was running out of options, but she still had one last card to play, and she was about to make the biggest mistake of her career. "Surely," she said, her voice now carrying a note of forced nonchalance, "you must admit that your position, your wealth, your influence, it all affects how people see her." Trump's response was immediate, and this time there was a sharpness to it that silenced the entire room. "You mean how people like you see her?" he asked, his gaze locked onto the host. "Because let me tell you something about influence and wealth. They don't create character. They reveal it. And what Melania has revealed through every challenge, every attack, every unfair criticism, is exactly why I'm proud to have her by my side." The host opened her mouth, but no words came out. She had walked straight into her own trap, and for the first time that night it was clear that she knew it. The conversation had shifted beyond her control, and the audience, the cameras, and the millions watching at home had seen it happen in real time. Trump wasn't just defending Melania, he was exposing the media's entire approach to conservative women, the way they were dismissed, diminished, and belittled simply because they didn't fit the narrative the press wanted to push. And the host, in her eagerness to land a blow, had only confirmed his point. She had given him the perfect stage to showcase exactly what was wrong with the media's treatment of Melania, and in doing so, she had lost the very battle she thought she was winning. The silence in the studio was deafening. The host shuffled her note cards, searching desperately for a way to pivot, to reclaim the upper hand. But it was too late. The damage was done. The audience had seen everything, and no amount of backtracking or spin could undo what had just happened. And as Trump sat there, composed, unshaken, and entirely in control, it was clear that he knew it too. The only question left was how much further the host would let this spiral before she finally realized that she had already lost. The host had played every card in her deck, trying and failing to shake Trump's composure, but she wasn't finished yet. Realizing that she was losing control of the conversation, she made a last desperate attempt, one so bold, so offensive, that it would either force Trump into an emotional misstep or cement her reputation as a fearless interviewer. She leaned in slightly, her voice adopting a casual, almost playful tone, masking the venom beneath. "Mr. Trump," she began, pausing just long enough to create tension, "you're a powerful, wealthy man. You could have any woman you want, yet you stay with someone who's," she hesitated deliberately before delivering the final insult, "aging alongside you. Don't you ever think about trading up?" The studio fell silent. The weight of her words hung in the air, the audacity of the question sucking the energy out of the room. Several audience members gasped, while others exchanged stunned glances, clearly uncomfortable with what had just been said. Even the production crew, seasoned veterans in the world of political television, seemed momentarily frozen. The host had not just crossed a line, she had obliterated it. She had reduced an entire marriage, decades of partnership, loyalty, and shared struggles, to something transactional, something shallow. It was an insult not just to Melania Trump, but to every woman who had ever been valued for more than just youth and appearance. Trump sat perfectly still, his expression unreadable. He didn't flinch, didn't react the way she had hoped. Instead, he let the silence stretch, let the weight of the question settle over the room, making sure that everyone watching truly understood what had just been asked. Then, in a voice as calm as it was powerful, he spoke. "Trading up?" he repeated, letting the phrase linger. "Let me tell you something about value, since that seems to be all you understand." His words were measured, deliberate, and the host's smug expression began to falter. "In business, yes. Sometimes you trade up. You find a better deal, a newer model, a shinier option. But we're not talking about real estate or cars here. We're talking about my wife, my partner, the mother of my son." The audience murmured in agreement, the tension shifting in Trump's favor. He wasn't just rejecting the premise of the question, he was dismantling it. "Real value," he continued, his voice unwavering, isn't about something new, something younger, something that looks good for the cameras. Real value is someone who stands by you when the cameras are off. Someone who tells you the truth when everyone else is telling you what you want to hear. Real value is loyalty, integrity, and character. Things that clearly aren't taught in journalism school anymore. The audience erupted in applause, drowning out any attempt by the host to regain control. She had walked into her own trap, exposing not Trump, but herself, revealing the very bias she had hoped to exploit. And in that moment, it was clear she had already lost. Trump let the applause settle before leaning slightly forward in his chair, his expression unwavering as he turned his attention back to the host. She had tried to bait him, to provoke an emotional reaction, but instead she had only given him the perfect opportunity to expose the very hypocrisy that defined the modern media. His voice, steady but laced with conviction, cut through the tension in the room. You sit here asking me if I've thought about trading up, as if loyalty, commitment, and shared history are things that should be tossed aside for convenience. But let me ask you something. Where's that same question when it comes to the people you praise? Where's that same scrutiny when it comes to the Hollywood elites, the politicians you celebrate, the so-called thought leaders who jump from one relationship to the next without a second thought? You call them empowered, you call them liberated, but when it comes to me, suddenly, a lasting marriage is something to be questioned? The host's confident facade cracked just slightly, her fingers tightening around the stack of note cards in front of her. She opened her mouth, perhaps to interject, but Trump didn't give her the chance. That's the problem with the media today, he continued, his voice growing stronger. You don't actually care about values. You don't care about character. You care about narratives. You build people up when they fit your agenda, and you tear them down when they don't. You talk about strong women until that woman happens to be conservative. You talk about empowerment until that empowerment comes from faith, from family, from standing for something real. The audience shifted, some nodding, others murmuring in agreement. The host, now visibly uncomfortable, tried to recover. Mr. Trump, I think you're misunderstanding, she started, but Trump cut her off with a kind of precision that left no room for misinterpretation. No, I understand perfectly, he said, his voice like a hammer striking steel. I understand that real commitment, real love, real partnership, those things don't fit into your sound bites. They don't make for viral headlines. You wanted a scandal. You wanted a controversy. But all you've done tonight is expose exactly why Americans don't trust the media anymore. Because you're not interested in the truth. You're interested in the spin. The silence in the studio was deafening. The host had no rebuttal. The audience had seen the entire exchange play out in real time, and there was no salvaging what had just happened. Trump had not only defended his wife, his marriage, and his values, he had turned the entire interview into a referendum on the very media machine that had tried to take him down. And for the millions watching at home, the message was clear. The media had overplayed its hand, and Trump had once again turned their own tactics against them. Trump let the weight of the moment settle, his expression firm yet composed, knowing he had just turned the entire conversation into something far bigger than an attack on his marriage. He wasn't just responding to an insult, he was making a statement, one that would resonate far beyond the walls of the studio. The host, visibly rattled, had no way to regain control. The question she had posed was meant to be provocative, meant to paint him as shallow, as someone who saw relationships as transactional. But instead, it had exposed the very mindset of those who treated marriage, loyalty, and commitment as outdated concepts, as things that could be discarded for something newer, something shinier. And Trump wasn't going to let that go unanswered. You know, he began, his voice measured yet unwavering, there are millions of Americans watching this right now. Men and women who have been married for decades, who have stood by their spouses through sickness, through hardship, through everything life has thrown at them, and they're hearing you ask me if I've thought about trading up? As if a marriage, a partnership, a lifetime of shared experiences is something you just throw away? Do you understand how insulting that is? Not just to my wife, but to every person out there who believes in something real? The host swallowed hard, her confident posture slipping as Trump continued. Melania and I, we built our life together. Not because it was easy, not because it was convenient, but because it mattered. Because real relationships aren't about what's new or what looks good on magazine covers. They're about standing by each other through thick and thin. You don't walk away from someone because they get older. You don't trade up because you have the power to. You stand by the person who stood by you. That's what marriage is. That's what love is. And maybe that's something you don't understand, but millions of Americans watching this right now do. The audience erupted in applause, some standing, some nodding in agreement, others visibly moved by what had just unfolded. The host, her hands clenched around her note cards, looked completely out of her depth. She had tried to turn Trump's marriage into a spectacle, but instead she had given him the perfect platform to reaffirm the very values so many Americans still held dear. Trump wasn't finished. He turned to the cameras, speaking past the host now, directly to the viewers at home. The media wants you to believe everything is temporary, that loyalty is weakness, that commitment is outdated. But that's not the America I know. That's not the America that built strong families, strong communities, strong values. And the fact that someone would even ask that question tonight, it tells you everything you need to know about how far we've strayed from what really matters. The host finally opened her mouth, but there was nothing left to say. The conversation was over, and Trump had won. Not just the argument, but the hearts of those watching. The powerful exchange between Trump and the TV host serves as more than just a viral media moment. It holds deep, lasting lessons about values, relationships, and the way modern society perceives commitment. For many older Americans who have witnessed shifting cultural norms over the decades, this moment is a stark reminder of the importance of loyalty, integrity, and the enduring nature of real relationships. In a world that increasingly values instant gratification, where commitment is often portrayed as outdated and relationships are treated as disposable, Trump's words resonated deeply. He reaffirmed a fundamental truth that many in past generations understood well. Marriage is not just about convenience or appearances. It is about standing by the person who has stood by you, through the good times and the bad. This lesson extends beyond marriage into every aspect of life. In friendships, in family ties, in personal and professional relationships, loyalty and commitment are the foundation of trust and stability. Many seniors understand this better than anyone, having lived through decades of challenges, losses, and victories alongside loved ones. They know that relationships are not measured by their ease, but by their endurance. True bonds are not built on perfection, but on the ability to weather storms together, to support one another, even when it's not easy. Furthermore, this moment revealed a broader issue, the way the media and popular culture have devalued traditional values, portraying long-term commitment as a weakness rather than a strength. There was a time when dedication, faithfulness, and honor were the cornerstones of a life well lived, and for many older Americans, those ideals are still worth defending. Trump's response was a rare moment in mainstream media where these principles were articulated boldly and unapologetically. It was a reminder that real love is not about trading up, but about valuing what truly matters: character, respect, and shared history. For those who have been married for decades, who have built their lives on these principles, this message is validation. It reaffirms that staying committed, prioritizing family, and honoring one's word are not outdated concepts. They are the very things that strengthen individuals, families, and communities. In a world that often moves too fast, where traditional values are dismissed as relics of the past, this moment was a call to remember that the strongest foundations in life are built on things that cannot be bought, cannot be replaced, and should never be taken for granted.